Thank you very much, Meg. And now we've Jane Souter again, who you well know from our academic and legal team.
Hi, everybody. So some of what I'm talking about is a little bit of what Meg has said and a little bit from Merge and that kind of thing, and then just trying to put it into a context where we can look and see what other countries besides Westminster do. So, you know, you've all heard plenty of times now that our model is a Westminster model copied directly from the Houses of Westminster. But of course, we also do have a very different sort of situation. So there's the size that Meg referred to there, but also the fact that we have a different electoral system means we have more parties that are in there and so on. But I think one of the crucial things is that a Westminster system sets up this government versus opposition dynamic. We still very much have that, and you can see it here, even the structure of the building. So you have government sit on one side, opposition on the other, and you have the kind of thing that we see on TV or that you would have got from various shows about, you know, the quick wit and the shouting abuse and the government voting one way and opposition the other is the kind of the caricature. Now, as Meg has said, that has loosened a good deal in the UK recently. But because of the sort of the strength, the sort of three-line whip, which I'll talk a little bit about later, you know, we still have very much it's government or opposition, and there's no sense of trying to reach consensus votes, which would be much more the norm in Europe. And plenty of votes in Germany and in Denmark and in other places, you'd have 80 or 90% of the Parliament could vote in favour of a bill if that was what they agreed with. So. Just a quick thing here. Which way is it going? To nowhere. Why doesn't this work? Okay, there. So that was just to show you two different parliaments. There's a Dutch and the German parliament there. So you can see even how the sort of the seating arrangement makes a difference to the kind of the culture and to the collegiality and to the amount of consensus building. And I know I've been struck here by the amount of TDs who've said to me that they actually really enjoy being here. And one of the reasons is that they can sit down and talk in a non-partisan way about kind of policy, that they don't have to be necessarily the opposite to somebody because they happen to be government or opposition. So it's just a thing to think about in terms of, you know, the way our culture kind of requires us to do that. And actually in one of the, I think is it the Bundesrat, Meg? Where they actually sit by region rather than by party, and often actually vote by region rather than by party. So it's not always party controlled. But we know here that we have a very strong party control system. The party leader, I think crucially the thing is that he controls all members' future careers. So if you want to be the leader of a committee, you want to be a junior minister, you want to be a cabinet minister, then you don't want to step out of line because there's no other way to power. The Taoiseach controls, or the Taoiseach for his party, controls your future, controls whether or not how your career is going to go. And you've seen that even recently, we've seen that the Taoiseach can remove people from committees as well if he doesn't like what the way they've been voting and so on. So we have very, very strong parties, and the Taoiseach has very strong controls over independent TD, over all his TDs. But I think the other crucial thing to think about in this as well is actually to what extent is it, you know, this whole argument has been set up as one of the executive versus the legislature, so the control and power that the cabinet have over backbenchers and over the running of the Dáil. But I think in one way there's actually a hidden power behind that, and that's actually the power of the bureaucracy. And, you know, I think it's interesting to think about the extent of bureaucratic capture of the executive. You know, if you look at this government, for example, when they went in, there was a lot of reforms which were going to happen which didn't. You know, some people would talk privately about there was a window of a few weeks, some would go to a few months, where ministers still very much had their own ideas before the policies that the bureaucracy had in the last government reasserted themselves. And of course, it's in the civil servants' interests. One of their jobs is, if you think about it, to maintain the status quo. Okay? The civil service doesn't want big change. The civil service doesn't want a lessening of executive power. They want to be able to deal with one minister, not a rabble of backbenchers. They, you know, most civil servants I've met don't particularly enjoy going before Dáil committees. They like that central control. So you need to think about, well, you know, what happens here? We have a big media thing against advisors, for instance, but ministers go in there, they're not policy experts. They meet civil servants who've been in there for years, who have a certain agenda, and they don't necessarily have the resources to be able to tackle that themselves. So there is a certain amount of bureaucratic capture. Just look at a couple of examples. One that we had here, like I don't know if you remember the letter that was supposedly came from Minister Phil Hogan. I don't know if anybody imagines that Phil Hogan wrote that letter, or was it civil servants in the Department of the Environment. So, you know, there can be very strong agendas coming through. Or if you look at FOI, which of course is the one thing that was in the programme for government, so the parties when they were in opposition were in favour of strong FOI, and yet we had at a very late stage of a committee, after it had been considered, the Minister for Reform coming in with changes that would actually make FOI much more expensive and much more difficult. You know, I would imagine that that was clearly a civil service priority. It wasn't a government priority to nobble FOI, it was a civil service priority. So a lot of these things kind of come through. So I think you need to think as well about ways of even empowering parties to be able to deal with the civil service. If we look here, this is just a table which has kind of done the rounds. It comes from Niamh Hardiman. So it just shows the kind of the dominance of the government over Parliament. And you see ourselves, the UK. The UK, I imagine, with the recent reforms that Meg has been involved with, would be dropping down from there now if the study were redone. But it's ourselves and the Greeks which have the most dominant executives. So I think maybe that tells its own story about, you know, how much we really want a very dominant executive. So to come on to some of the other things, on the left there we have a picture of our current Ceann Comhairle. His job is obviously to maintain order in the House, allow members to take part in debate, make sure business is conducted in an efficient manner. But even he has said that the office is badly in need of modernisation. So I think the kind of thing that Meg was talking about there, that's happened in the British Parliament about the, you know, a seeker's election for the Ceann Comhairle, that he would be somebody that's elected by the members and not chosen again as a favoured patronage appointment. And again, often one that actually has as much to do with constituency as it does with personality, or it has done on occasion in the past, because of course the Ceann Comhairle gets returned without election at the next bill. And the other picture, the rather gruesome one there on the right, is a picture of a guillotine. So I'll show you some numbers now that compare our use of the guillotine with those in other countries. But essentially there's 5 stages of any bill, and I'm not going to spend days going through them, but there's 3 that really matter. But what happens is you can introduce amendments like the ones at the FOI at a very late stage, even at the committee stage, and then you can just say, okay, there's no more debate. And it just gets, as I think Fintan O'Toole called it, sort of rammed through. So if you think about the property tax bill, I think the first property tax bill was put through the Dáil in a total of 2 hours. There were 88 amendments, and only 3 of those amendments were actually discussed. So that's what the guillotine does. So in some ways, some people might say, well, it's efficient and we can get much more laws passed, but completely adds to executive dominance, as you might imagine, but it also adds to the likelihood of poor legislation getting passed, because if things aren't scrutinised properly, the chances of something getting through that is going to cause later problems increases dramatically. So the government has said that it's going to, it's got targeting a 20% reduction in the use of the guillotine, but it's still used an awful lot, and even if that were to be achieved, I'd argue that it's still overly used. So if we look here at this is a table which shows how curtailed debate can be, and basically the majority, so the France, Greece, again, Ireland and the UK were the countries that use the guillotine to a great extent. Okay, the ones that are not allowed to use it at all are Finland, the Netherlands and Sweden. Now people argue if you can't use it at all, then business can go on for a long time. It can be very inefficient. So you'll see most countries have actually chosen a sort of a middle ground. So you've got everybody from Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland have a kind of a middle ground where it must be agreed in advance between all the parties that a guillotine is okay. So it can't just be put through by government parties. So that's the norm in Europe, is that a guillotine would be a cross-party agreement rather than just a government decision. This table here, it's kind of hard to see, but the first column here, there's an S and an O, and it tells you where has open votes for electing the Ceann Comhairle and where has secret votes. Now, obviously, if you have an open vote, it sounds good, doesn't it, an open vote, but of course it means that everybody can see the way that you voted and therefore your vote can be controlled. So a secret vote allows people to vote for who they actually really want. Now, of course, this doesn't always happen. In some places you have to show your vote to the whip on the way through, even when it's a secret vote. And, so it's not an ideal kind of scenario, but, it protects you to some extent. And the other kind of things that people look at is, look, can the Ceann Comhairle summon a plenary session? And in most countries, the Ceann Comhairle can say, okay, we're going to have a plenary session about a debate or about something that we want, but not here, the UK or Switzerland, but almost everywhere else. And can the Ceann Comhairle or the leader, can they set the agenda of Parliament? Not in Ireland, France, Germany, Spain and Sweden. It's less common than the other, but still in many countries the leader of the House can actually set that. So in some places there are quite sort of wide-ranging jobs that the leader of the House can do. So here I just have a little picture there of, you might recognise some of the members of a committee in action. And as Meg said, our committees, we've seen them more in newspapers in the last 6 months than in the past. They are doing more and so on. Somebody gave me the answer to Meg's question earlier, so I think I might just share it with you. The last time our subcommittee on Dole Reform sat, Pat Carey from Fianna Fáil was the chair. So it was quite some time ago. Angus is saying no. Oh, right, okay. Well, I was told earlier that wasn't the case, so there you go. But anyway, that committee or a reconstituted version of it could be one that you're talking about. But I think one of the big problems we have to think about here is actually our culture. So if you talk to a lot of TDs, and I'm sure some of the ones here, at least privately, they'll tell you that there's no votes in committee work, unless you happen to be on one of the big ones that's, in the newspapers doing a lot. So, what do we actually demand of our TDs? We're not asking them to do committee work. We're not demanding it of them. We want them to be on call for our medical cards or our passport applications or, whatever else is the case. So, there is a cultural thing here as well. It's not just about rules. So we need to think of ways of actually incentivising, of getting TDs to actually want to do more work in committees. A lot of TDs, that I'm sure everybody here is an exception, but they think of their main job is actually to get re-elected. So that's what they would spend a lot of their time on. So if your main job is to get re-elected and then there's no votes in committees, what are you going to do? Okay, so like I've stood in front of committees as other people have, and there's some, very diligent people, and you see great examples on YouTube, people asking great questions, really examining and so on. But then there's plenty where people wander in and out and they sit there texting or tweeting and make statements and then wander out again. So, there needs to be a kind of a cultural thing where we actually care what happens at committees. Was there something else? Oh, I think a really big thing about committees is their resources. So they have very few resources compared with other ones, very few administrative resources, and effectively no legal resources. So the government has a trump card. The government can always turn around and say, well, we have the advice of the Attorney General. And so whenever they say that, that's their trump card, they put it down. They may or may not, usually not, publish the advice of the Attorney General. But the TDs actually have no recourse to their own legal advice. So, no, not proper ones. You ask Leah, who is here, and if anybody is asked about, if somebody talked to her about, well, can you have, and I have to thank Charlie Flanagan for some of the suggestion of this, but Leah also suggested it. If she was asked about the constitutionality of a bill, she wasn't allowed to answer that as the legal advisor in the Dáil, and the government would say no. So to give the backbenchers access to legal advice where the advisor can actually talk about the constitutionality or otherwise of a bill would dramatically increase the power of the committees. And the other thing that would make a difference is if you look at the power in terms of when you look at it, we saw our budget was in front of the Bundestag before it was in front of the Dáil. So rather than saying it should be later to the Bundestag, shouldn't we be saying it should be earlier to the Dáil? To actually have more, it's beginning to move a little bit in this direction, but examining current expenditure more in current time in advance of it being spent rather than always examining things afterwards. Or in Denmark, for example, the committees are very powerful and the ministers have to come in before they go to Europe and talk about exactly what it is that they're going to talk about there. Or the other suggestion is, for example, in the European Parliament, they've 2 weeks of plenaries, a week of committees, and then a week of party business. So that means the committee and the plenary business never clash, never overlap. Whereas in our chamber, the committee and plenary business can clash and overlap all of the time. So to separate those as well would incentivise people to spend more time in committees.
Would you mind?
Oh, okay. And the last thing is on the whip. So these are the things. Do you want to consider electing the Ceann Comhairle, allowing them to take more control of the Dáil agenda, electing chairs, relaxing whips, not having a 3-line whip all the time, increasing admin and policy support, giving committees and backbenchers their own constitutional legal advisor, and more independent policy advice in general.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.